The sun hung low over the city as the rush of a busy evening began. Cars honked in the distance, and the sidewalks buzzed with people heading to their favorite spots after a long day. Among the crowd, a well-dressed man walked calmly, his stride confident but unassuming. His crisp suit and polished shoes hinted at his profession, but he wasn't the type to announce who he was to the world. He preferred actions to speak louder than words, and tonight, he just wanted to enjoy a quiet dinner at a well-known upscale restaurant in the heart of town. As he approached the entrance, the warm glow from the restaurant's windows beckoned him inside. The smell of sizzling steaks and freshly baked bread wafted through the air, promising a meal worth savoring. But as he stepped through the door, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations hushed, eyes darted toward him, and the once friendly vibe seemed to chill. The hostess at the podium barely glanced up. She was busy shuffling through reservations, her demeanor sharp and professional, but a little too dismissive. When the man politely asked for a table, her eyes flickered with a mix of surprise and hesitation. "Do you have a reservation?" she asked, her tone cool. "I don't," he admitted with a warm smile. "But I was hoping you could accommodate me." Her lips pressed into a thin line as she gave him a once-over. "I'm sorry, sir. We're fully booked tonight." Her words were polite, but her body language told another story. Her eyes lingered too long on his face, her expression tinged with something he couldn't quite name but recognized all too well. The man nodded, taking a step back. "I understand," he said, his voice calm. He glanced around the restaurant, noticing several empty tables scattered throughout the room. A small pang of disappointment tugged at him, but he wasn't one to make a scene. He thanked her and turned to leave. Before he could step out, a loud laugh from a nearby group caught his attention. A cluster of well-dressed diners, clearly regulars, exchanged amused glances, one of them muttering just loud enough for him to hear. "Guess they're getting pickier about who they let in these days." The man paused, his back stiffening for a brief moment before he turned to look at the group. Their eyes met, and he could feel the weight of their judgment. He gave them a faint, knowing smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes, and walked out into the night. Outside, he leaned against a nearby lamppost, letting the cool evening air wash over him. He wasn't angry, he was used to situations like this. But tonight felt different. There was an edge to the experience that gnawed at him. He'd seen the empty tables. He'd felt the subtle, unspoken dismissal. And yet, he wasn't going to let it ruin his night. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the name he was looking for. He hesitated for a moment before hitting call. A familiar voice answered on the second ring, warm and welcoming. "Hey," the man said, his voice lighter now. "Change of plans? Meet me at the restaurant. I'll explain everything when you get here." As he waited, he watched the diners inside through the window. They were laughing, sipping wine, and enjoying their meals, blissfully unaware of the story that was about to unfold. Little did they know, the man they had dismissed wasn't just anyone. And when they discovered who he was, their reactions would be unforgettable. What happened next would challenge their assumptions, redefine their perceptions, and leave everyone, including the man himself, stunned. Stay tuned, because this story is just getting started. The man stayed outside, leaning casually against the lamppost, the coolness of the evening air settling over him like a light blanket. His phone buzzed softly in his hand as he checked the time. It wouldn't be long now. He had made the call, and he knew that soon, things would take a turn that no one inside the restaurant could predict. Yet, he wasn't angry, no, that wasn't it. Disappointment, sure. A trace of weariness, perhaps. But anger? That wasn't how he handled things. He allowed his thoughts to wander as he watched people pass by, some hurrying along with purpose, others strolling leisurely, enjoying the evening. A couple stopped to glance at the restaurant menu displayed by the door, chatting excitedly about trying it out someday. He gave them a small smile as they walked away, oblivious to the moment he just had inside. It was a scene he had seen before, a story he knew all too well. He thought back to how hard he'd worked to get to where he was today. Nothing about his journey had been handed to him. Growing up, he had seen firsthand the struggles his parents faced, the sacrifices they made so he could have a shot at something better. They instilled in him a sense of purpose, a drive to rise above the limitations others tried to place on him. Those lessons stayed with him, guiding him through years of schooling, grueling exams, and countless late nights in sterile hospital rooms. Yes, he had earned his place in the world. He had fought for it, and he wore the weight of that fight like a badge of honor. But moments like this reminded him that no matter how far he had come, there would always be places where he was still seen as someone who didn't belong. It was an exhausting realization, one that chipped away at the optimism he tried so hard to hold on to. Just then, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb, breaking his train of thought. The driver stepped out, holding the door open for a woman dressed in a sharp, tailored outfit. Her heels clicked against the pavement as she walked toward him, her face lighting up when she saw him. "You didn't tell me you were in town," she said, a teasing smile on her lips. He chuckled softly. "I like to keep you on your toes." The woman raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "You've got that something's up look. What's going on?" He gestured toward the restaurant, the faintest hint of amusement playing at the corners of his mouth. "Let's just say I had a little trouble getting a table." She glanced at the restaurant, her sharp eyes taking in the scene. It didn't take her long to understand. "Ah," she said, her tone cooling slightly. "One of those places." He nodded. "I thought about letting it go. But then I figured, why not turn this into an opportunity?" Her curiosity was piqued. "Opportunity for what?" "You'll see," he said, his smile widening. "But first, let's go inside." She gave him a look that was equal parts skepticism and intrigue but followed him without question. Together, they walked back to the restaurant entrance, where the hostess was now helping another couple. Her expression shifted the moment she saw him again, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face before she quickly masked it. "I told you, sir, we're fully booked," she said, her tone firmer now. The man didn't argue. Instead, he leaned in slightly, his voice low but calm. "I understand. But I think it's worth double-checking." The hostess hesitated, glancing at the woman beside him. Something about the way they carried themselves seemed to unsettle her, but she held her ground. "There's really nothing I can do." Before the man could respond, the restaurant manager appeared, drawn by the tension. He was a tall, well-groomed man with the polished demeanor of someone who prided himself on running a tight ship. His gaze flicked between the man and the woman, sizing them up. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice smooth but authoritative. The woman spoke up this time, her tone measured but unmistakably firm. "There might be. It seems like there's some confusion about availability." The manager's eyes narrowed slightly. "As my hostess explained, we're fully booked tonight." The man exchanged a look with the woman, then reached into his pocket, pulling out a sleek leather business card holder. He slid out a card and handed it to the manager, who took it reluctantly. The manager's expression shifted as he read the name on the card, his confidence faltering for just a moment before he quickly recovered. "I see," the manager said, his tone more cautious now. "I wasn't aware." The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "No need to explain. I'm not here to cause trouble. I just wanted to see how things would play out." The manager cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "Let me see what I can do." As the manager hurried away, the hostess stood frozen, her face pale. The woman turned to the man, her voice low. "You really know how to make an entrance, don't you?" He shrugged. "Sometimes you have to let people show you who they really are before you decide how to respond." They waited in silence, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. Inside, diners continued their meals, oblivious to the drama unfolding by the door. But it wouldn't stay that way for long. Something told the man that tonight's events were about to ripple far beyond this restaurant, and he was ready for it. The hostess stood awkwardly at her podium, pretending to shuffle through her reservation book. She glanced up occasionally, her expression tight, as if trying to anticipate what would happen next. The couple near the entrance, a man and a woman whose presence exuded quiet authority, had disrupted the smooth flow of her evening. She could feel her cheeks flush, the weight of judgment hanging heavy in the air, but she didn't dare say another word. Inside, the restaurant buzzed on, diners completely unaware of the unfolding tension. Servers weaved through the tables, balancing trays of steaming plates and refilling wine glasses, their practiced smiles hiding any sign of stress. At one table, a group of friends clinked glasses, celebrating something that sparked laughter loud enough to carry across the room. At another, a couple leaned close, sharing an intimate moment. The scene was a picture of elegance and contentment, a world the man at the entrance had been deemed unfit to join. The manager reappeared after what felt like an eternity, his expression carefully neutral. "We found a table for you," he announced, his tone betraying a mix of reluctance and obligation. He gestured toward a small, tucked-away corner of the dining room, far from the prime spots by the windows or the warmth of the fireplace. The man exchanged a glance with the woman beside him. Her raised eyebrows said everything. But he nodded politely, following the manager without a word. They were seated quickly, and the manager lingered for a moment, as if unsure whether to say more. When no protest came, he disappeared back into the flow of the restaurant, relief etched into his face. The woman leaned forward, her voice low but firm. "A table by the kitchen? Really? This is their idea of making things right?" The man gave a small, wry smile. "I told you, let them show who they are." "Fair enough," she said, sitting back and folding her arms. "But I hope you're planning to do more than just observe." "Oh, I am," he said, picking up the menu. "But timing is everything." As they browsed the menu, snippets of conversation drifted their way. At a nearby table, two older gentlemen were in deep discussion, their voices hushed but urgent. "Did you see who walked in just now?" one whispered. "The guy in the suit." The other shook his head. "No." "Why?" The first leaned in closer. "I think he's, you know, that guy. The one from the news a while back." The second man frowned. "What do you mean?" The first hesitated, glancing around. "I'm not sure, but he looks familiar." "Could be him." "If it is, though, what's he doing here?" The man at the corner table noticed the exchange, but gave no indication he had heard. Instead, he focused on the woman across from him, their conversation light but deliberate, as if testing the waters before something bigger. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, the staff was abuzz. Word of the unexpected guest had reached them, sparking curiosity and unease. "Are you serious?" one chef asked, wiping his hands on a towel. "That guy is here?" "Yeah," another said, peeking through the swinging doors. "Front table near the kitchen." "Can't believe they didn't recognize him right away." "Well, they know now," the first muttered. "Wonder how this is gonna play out." Back in the dining room, the man and woman had just placed their orders when a voice interrupted them. It was one of the diners who had been watching them closely since they arrived, a man in his 50s with a commanding presence and an air of self-importance. He approached their table with an overly polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Excuse me," he began, his tone oozing insincerity. "I couldn't help but notice you earlier. You seem familiar. Have we met before?" The man looked up, his expression calm and unreadable. "I don't believe we have." "Ah," the diner said, clearly fishing for more. "Well, you have one of those faces, I suppose." Enjoy your meal. As the man walked away, the woman shook her head. They're starting to piece it together. Let them, the man said, his tone still light. It's more interesting that way. The night wore on, the restaurant slowly settling into a rhythm as the peak dinner rush passed. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. More diners began to notice the man at the corner table, their whispers growing louder, their glances less subtle. It wasn't long before one of the servers approached, nervously carrying a tray with 2 glasses of wine. This is from the table near the fireplace, the server said, setting the glasses down. They wanted to welcome you. The man gave a polite nod but didn't touch the wine. Instead, he turned his attention to the woman, his voice low. It's starting. What's starting? She asked, her tone curious. The shift, he said, leaning back in his chair. First, the curiosity. Then, the attempts to make up for earlier. And finally, the part where everyone realizes just how badly they miscalculated. She tilted her head, watching him closely. And what are you going to do? He smiled, but this time, it reached his eyes. I'm going to let them keep digging their hole. For now. The suspense lingered in the air, thick and unrelenting. Whatever was coming, it wasn't over, not by a long shot. The evening unfolded like a tightly wound clock ticking closer to an inevitable breaking point. The man and the woman remained seated in their corner, their quiet conversation interspersed with moments of watchful silence. Around them, the whispers grew louder, the glances more frequent. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was recognition, though incomplete. The diners didn't know the full story yet, but they sensed something significant was happening. At a nearby table, a young couple exchanged murmurs while stealing glances at the corner. I think he's someone important, the woman whispered, her excitement barely contained. Do you see the way people keep looking at him? The man shrugged. Maybe. Or maybe they're just nosy. Either way, this place has been weird tonight. The staff, too, was feeling the shift. Servers whispered in the back, their trays momentarily forgotten as they pieced together fragments of gossip. He's got to be someone big, one said, glancing toward the swinging doors. Did you see how the manager practically tripped over himself earlier? Yeah, but why seat him by the kitchen if he's so important? Another replied, frowning. Maybe they didn't realize who he was at first, the first one said. But now, they're definitely trying to figure out how to fix it. The man himself remained composed, though he couldn't ignore the mounting tension. He could feel the eyes on him, hear the whispers. It was a sensation he had grown used to in his line of work, but tonight it carried a sharper edge. This wasn't admiration or respect, it was a mix of unease and curiosity, tinged with guilt from those who had initially dismissed him. The woman across from him leaned in, her voice low but insistent. They're unraveling. You can feel it. What's your move? He considered her question, his gaze thoughtful. Not yet, he said finally. Let them squirm a little longer. As the night continued, the restaurant's polished facade began to crack. The manager, once so confident, now moved through the room with a nervous energy, his smile strained. He stopped by their table twice, offering complimentary appetizers and asking if everything was to their liking. Each time, the man responded with polite indifference, his calm demeanor only heightening the manager's discomfort. At one point, a woman from another table approached. She was elegantly dressed, her diamonds catching the light as she smiled tightly. I'm sorry to bother you, she began, her voice dripping with forced sweetness. But my husband and I couldn't help but notice. You're quite familiar. Are you in the public eye? The man looked up, his expression neutral. I've been in the public eye, yes. Her smile widened, though it didn't reach her eyes. I knew it. I told my husband you were someone important. Well, it's such an honor to see you here. Truly. Thank you, he said simply, offering nothing more. The woman lingered, clearly hoping for a deeper conversation, but when none came, she awkwardly excused herself and returned to her table. The man watched her go, his expression unreadable. The woman across from him smirked. You're enjoying this more than you'll admit. He chuckled softly. Maybe a little. But it's not about enjoyment. It's about the lesson. The air in the restaurant grew heavier, the tension almost palpable. Diners who hadn't been paying attention earlier were now craning their necks, trying to catch a glimpse of the man who had become the center of the room's unspoken drama. Conversations grew quieter, replaced by speculative whispers. In the kitchen, the chef was growing restless. I don't like this, he muttered to one of the sous chefs. Whatever's happening out there, it's not good for business. Should we do something? The sous chef asked, uncertain. Let the manager handle it, the chef said, though his voice lacked conviction. He's the one who seated him back there. Let him deal with the fallout. The manager, meanwhile, was running out of ways to smooth over the situation. He knew the man in the corner wasn't making a scene, but his mere presence had disrupted the delicate balance of the restaurant. Every glance, every whisper, every awkward interaction was a reminder of the mistake that had been made. Finally, the manager approached their table again, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. I hope you're enjoying your meal, he said, his tone overly pleasant. If there's anything we can do to make your experience better, please don't hesitate to let me know. The man looked up, his gaze steady. You've done enough, he said, his words calm but pointed. The manager swallowed hard, offering a strained smile before retreating once more. The woman watched him go, shaking her head. They're unraveling faster than I expected. Good, the man said quietly. Because I think it's time. The suspense hung in the air, thick and unrelenting. Whatever he was planning, it was clear the moment was drawing closer. And when it came, it wouldn't just be the diners and staff who were caught off guard. The entire room was teetering on the edge of revelation, and the fallout was going to be impossible to ignore. The man glanced at his watch, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at his lips. The timing was perfect, as if everything had been leading to this very moment. He pushed his chair back slightly and stood, drawing the eyes of nearly every diner in the room. Conversations dropped to a murmur, the air electric with anticipation. The woman remained seated, her expression one of calm amusement. She could tell something was about to happen, though even she wasn't entirely sure what. Here we go, she muttered under her breath, her gaze following him as he stepped away from the table. The man walked slowly, deliberately, toward the center of the restaurant, where the lighting was warm and inviting, meant to highlight the carefully curated elegance of the space. All eyes were on him now, their curiosity palpable. He paused near the fireplace, his posture relaxed but his presence commanding. Without raising his voice, he spoke, his words cutting through the low hum of the room. Excuse me, everyone, he began, his tone even and measured. I realize my presence has caused quite a stir tonight. Some of you may recognize me, others may not. But before we go any further, I think it's important to address something. The diners exchanged puzzled glances, unsure of what was happening but unable to look away. The staff froze in place, their movements halted mid-step as they listened. When I arrived here tonight, he continued, his gaze sweeping across the room, I was denied a table. Not because the restaurant was fully booked, as I was told, but because of assumptions made about me, assumptions based on nothing more than how I looked. A ripple of discomfort spread through the room. Some diners shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others stared at him with wide eyes, the weight of his words sinking in. The manager appeared from the corner of the room, his face pale but determined. Sir, he interjected, his voice tight. I don't think this is the appropriate time or place. The man held up a hand, silencing him with a calm but authoritative gesture. You had your chance to make this right, he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "Now it's my turn to speak." The tension in the room was palpable, the kind that makes every second feel stretched and heavy. The woman at the table watched intently, her lips curving into a small, approving smile. She knew he had planned this moment carefully, but even she hadn't anticipated the intensity of it. "Let me be clear," the man continued, his voice steady. "I didn't come here tonight looking for special treatment. I didn't expect to be recognized or catered to. All I wanted was a meal, like anyone else. But instead, I was met with rejection not because of who I am, but because of what someone assumed about me." A murmur swept through the room, the diners visibly uncomfortable now. Some avoided his gaze, while others looked at him with newfound curiosity or guilt. "And here's the twist," he said, a faint smile returning to his face. "You didn't just deny a random guest tonight. You denied someone who has spent their entire career helping people, saving lives, and making a difference in the very community this restaurant serves." The whispers grew louder, the weight of his words rippling through the crowd. A few diners looked at each other, the recognition dawning on their faces. One woman gasped softly, covering her mouth as the realization hit her. The manager stepped forward again, desperation etched into his features. "Sir, I assure you, this was a misunderstanding. If we had known—" "That's exactly the problem," the man interrupted, his tone sharper now. "You shouldn't need to know who someone is to treat them with dignity and respect. It shouldn't take a title or a reputation to be seen as worthy of basic decency." The room fell silent, his words landing like a hammer. The staff stood frozen, the diners unsure of how to respond. Even the manager seemed at a loss, his carefully constructed composure crumbling under the weight of the moment. Just then, the door to the restaurant swung open, and a group of people entered, their presence immediately commanding attention. They were dressed sharply, their movements purposeful. One of them, a man with an air of quiet authority, approached the man by the fireplace and extended a hand. "Good to see you again," the newcomer said, his voice warm but formal. "We didn't expect to find you here." The man shook his hand, a knowing smile on his face. Plans change. The group's arrival added a new layer to the tension, the diners now on edge as they tried to piece together what was happening. The woman at the table leaned forward slightly, her curiosity piqued. Whatever was unfolding, it was bigger than she had anticipated. The manager's face turned an even paler shade of white as he realized who the newcomers were. He stepped back, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to maintain his composure. The man turned to the room once more, his gaze steady. "It seems my evening just got a little more interesting," he said, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. "But don't worry, we're not done here yet." The suspense was unbearable, the air thick with anticipation. Whatever was about to happen next would change everything. The air in the restaurant had shifted, heavy with a tension that could not be ignored. Every eye was fixed on the man standing near the fireplace, his presence commanding yet calm. The group that had just entered moved closer, their expressions serious but respectful. Whispers rippled through the room as diners tried to make sense of the sudden escalation. The man exchanged a few quiet words with the newcomer who had greeted him, then turned back to the room. His voice carried easily, firm yet measured. "Many of you may still be wondering who I am and why tonight's events matter so much. Let me clear that up for you." He stepped forward slightly, his gaze sweeping over the diners and staff alike. "I am a doctor. I've spent years serving this community, often working long hours in hospitals, clinics, and even outreach programs to ensure that everyone, regardless of their background, receives the care they deserve. Some of you may have seen me on local news or read about my work, but none of that should matter here." There was a collective intake of breath as the diners began to connect the dots. A few heads nodded, and whispers grew louder, some expressing recognition, others disbelief. "Tonight," he continued, his voice steady, "I came here not as a doctor, not as someone with a title, but simply as a person looking for a meal. And what I was met with was judgment and dismissal, not because of anything I said or did, but because of assumptions made about me the moment I walked through that door. The manager, who had been standing frozen in place, stepped forward again, his voice shaking. Sir, I cannot apologize enough. This was a terrible mistake. We would never. The man held up a hand, silencing him. Your apology, while appreciated, doesn't change what happened. And it doesn't change the fact that I am not the only person who has likely been treated this way. How many others have been turned away, dismissed, or judged unfairly in this very restaurant? How many voices have gone unheard because they didn't have the platform or privilege to demand better? The room was silent now, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. Even the sound of silverware clinking against plates had ceased. The staff exchanged uneasy glances, the implications of his statement sinking in. And then came the twist. The woman who had been sitting at the table finally stood, her calm demeanor replaced by a quiet intensity. She walked over to the man and stood beside him, addressing the room with a voice that was steady but commanding. What none of you realize, she said, is that tonight wasn't just a coincidence. This wasn't just about dinner or an insult. Tonight was a test. The diners looked at each other in confusion, murmurs breaking out once again. The woman continued, her gaze sharp as it moved across the room. We represent an organization that has been assessing businesses across this city, looking for establishments that truly uphold the values of inclusion, respect, and integrity. Tonight, this restaurant was on that list. The manager's face went slack, his eyes wide with disbelief. A test? He stammered. You mean this was? Yes, she said firmly, cutting him off. And unfortunately, you failed. Not because mistakes were made, mistakes happened, but because of how those mistakes were handled. The excuses, the dismissiveness, the attempts to smooth things over without truly addressing the root of the problem, that's what sealed it. The group that had entered earlier stepped forward now, their presence more formal and authoritative. One of them, a man in a sharp suit, addressed the diners. What you've just witnessed is part of an initiative to promote accountability in businesses that claim to serve this community. This restaurant will be given a chance to make amends, but it will require significant changes not just in policy, but in practice. The diners were stunned, the weight of the revelation sinking in. Some looked relieved, others uncomfortable, as if realizing their own complicity in remaining silent during the earlier events. The man turned to the manager, his expression still calm but resolute. You have a choice now. You can take this as an opportunity to grow and do better, or you can dismiss it and risk losing the trust of the very community you serve. The decision is yours. The manager nodded, his face pale but earnest. We'll do better, he said quietly. I promise. The man regarded him for a moment, then nodded. Good. Because everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, no matter who they are or where they come from. As the group prepared to leave, the diners began clapping softly at first, then louder, the sound filling the room. The man and woman exchanged a glance, a quiet understanding passing between them. They had come with a purpose, and they had achieved it. But just as they reached the door, the man turned back, his voice carrying one final, unexpected twist. Oh, and one more thing. I wasn't alone in deciding to test this place. Some of your regulars, your trusted patrons, they've been part of this initiative all along. The gasps were audible as diners looked around, wondering who among them had been part of the test. The man smiled faintly and tipped his head in acknowledgement before stepping out into the night, leaving the restaurant and its patrons to grapple with the lesson they'd just been taught. As the door swung shut behind the man and the group, the restaurant felt like it had been caught in the eye of a storm. For a moment, there was stillness, no one quite knew how to react. Then the murmurs began, rippling across the tables like aftershocks. Some diners debated quietly among themselves, others simply sat in stunned silence, replaying the events of the evening in their minds. The manager remained rooted to the spot, his face pale and his hands gripping the back of a chair as though it was the only thing keeping him steady. One of the servers approached cautiously, her expression unsure. "What do we do now?" she asked softly. The manager exhaled slowly, letting go of the chair and straightening his posture. "We fix it," he said, though his voice was shaky. "Starting tonight." He turned to his staff, who had gathered in the back near the kitchen, their faces a mix of concern and apprehension. "I know what you're all thinking," he began, addressing them directly. This was a wake-up call. A hard one. But if there's one thing we can take from this, it's that we have the chance to make things right. To be better. The staff exchanged glances, some nodding hesitantly, others still uncertain. The chef stepped forward, wiping his hands on a towel. "How do we even begin?" he asked, his tone more practical than accusatory. The manager hesitated for only a moment before replying. "We start by acknowledging the problem. Then we learn from it. Training, new policies, whatever it takes will make sure this never happens again." Not to him, not to anyone. Across the restaurant, the diners had begun to leave, their conversations quieter than usual, their expressions thoughtful. Many left their tips on the tables as they exited, their actions a silent acknowledgement of the staff's position in the night's events. A few lingered near the door, exchanging hushed words about the man and the impact of his speech. By the time the last table was cleared and the chairs stacked for the night, the weight of the evening hung heavy over everyone. The manager gathered his team for an impromptu meeting, standing in the center of the dining room as they formed a loose circle around him. "I know tonight was hard," he said, his voice more resolute now. "But it's not the end. In fact, it's a beginning. We've been given a second chance to prove ourselves to our customers, to our community, and to each other. Let's not waste it." The staff nodded, their expressions a mix of determination and hope. Whatever lay ahead, they knew it would take effort, but the alternative, a return to the way things had been, was no longer an option. Outside the restaurant, the man and woman walked down the quiet street, the cool night air a welcome contrast to the tension of the evening. They didn't speak at first, their footsteps echoing softly against the pavement. Finally, the woman broke the silence, her tone light but laced with curiosity. "Do you think they'll actually change?" The man glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe," he said after a moment. "But change doesn't happen overnight. It's not just about one moment or one decision, it's about what comes after. The small choices, the everyday actions. That's what really matters." She nodded, her gaze forward as they continued walking. "Still, tonight was a start. You made them see something they couldn't ignore." He smiled faintly, a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. "It's not about me. It's about the lesson. If they carry that forward, then it's worth it." As they reached the corner, a car pulled up, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The driver stepped out, nodding respectfully as he opened the door for them. The woman slid into the back seat, followed by the man, who paused for a moment before turning to the driver. "Thank you," he said simply, his tone genuine. The driver nodded, a small smile on his face. "No, sir." "Thank you." As the car pulled away, the restaurant grew smaller in the rearview mirror, its lights still glowing softly against the night. Inside, the staff had begun cleaning up, their movements slower but more purposeful. The manager stood near the hostess stand, flipping through a notepad filled with scribbled ideas for changes, some small, some ambitious, all necessary. The diners who had witnessed the evening's events went home with their own thoughts, some inspired, others unsettled. The story of what had happened spread quickly over the following days, shared in whispers and social media posts. Many praised the man for his courage and grace, others reflected on their own biases and behaviors. Weeks later, the restaurant reopened after a brief closure for staff training and policy updates. The changes were noticeable: new faces among the staff, a more inclusive atmosphere, and a manager who seemed genuinely invested in every guest's experience. Word of mouth brought in new customers, many eager to see the transformation for themselves. The man never returned to the restaurant, but his presence lingered in subtle ways. A small plaque hung near the entrance, bearing a simple but powerful message: every person deserves respect, dignity, and kindness. Beneath it was a quote attributed to him, one that had resonated with everyone who heard it that night: "It's not about who you are, it's about how you're treated." The story didn't end there, of course. Change is never a single moment, but a series of choices, each one building on the last. For the restaurant, for the staff, and for the community, it was a beginning. And for the man, it was a reminder of why he did what he did, not for recognition or praise, but for the chance to make a difference, one moment at a time.